Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight we're drifting far, farther than memory, deeper than history, into a world so old it's almost unrecognisable. Not the ancient pyramids, not the dinosaurs, not even the first forests. No, tonight we're going back 2 billion years, a time when Earth looked unfamiliar, when oxygen was a newcomer, when continents were strangers still learning how to dance, a time when the sky might have looked pink, the seas green, and the land, well, there wasn't much land to speak of. Life was just learning how to breathe, and in doing so, it nearly killed everything. But before we sink into the swirl of ancient oceans and alien atmospheres, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you peek at the clock, what time is it for you right now? Strange, isn't it? A story about 2 billion years ago, and yet here we are, sharing this quiet little moment across time zones and continents. If you find this a soothing way to unwind, a gentle nudge toward dreams, or just a curious companion at the end of a long day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this little circle of starlit science reach others who might need a moment of calm too. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you wide awake, but if it does, well, at least you'll drift off with visions of volcanoes, microbes, and skies the colour of rusted iron. So settle in, slow your thoughts, let's begin. Because if you zoom out far enough, past kings and empires, past extinction events and ice ages, you'll find an Earth both ancient and alien. 2 billion years ago, the air was toxic, the seas were thick with strange bacteria, and yet, something was stirring. A planetary transformation was already underway, one so massive it changed the chemistry of the oceans, the fabric of the atmosphere, and the fate of nearly every living thing. And somehow, some tiny, fragile flickers of life survived. But how? And what exactly was Earth really like back then? Let's find out. Some stories begin with thunder. This one begins with a compass needle. It was the kind of mystery you'd only notice if you were the sort of person who really pays attention to rocks. The kind of person who looks at an outcrop and sees a timeline, not just stone. In the late 20th century, a geologist was wandering through the Canadian Shield, a vast stretch of exposed bedrock that dates back billions of years, when something odd caught his attention. He was carrying a standard field compass, the kind that should obediently point north. But near a certain formation it hesitated, twitched, refused to settle. Now, a less curious soul might have chalked that up to a local anomaly, shrugged and moved on. But scientists are often professional question askers, and the question became, what happened here, deep in the crust, long before the continents looked anything like they do now? That question would echo across labs and universities, ricocheting between mineral samples, magnetic surveys, and isotope analyses. And slowly a picture began to form, not just of ancient rocks, but of an ancient world. A world caught in one of the greatest planetary mood swings in Earth's history. A time when life nearly ended itself by trying something new. It's a hard thing to picture. 2 billion years ago is so far outside human scale that even imagination starts to get a little dizzy. To put it in perspective, if Earth's history were compressed into a single calendar year, humans wouldn't appear until the last hour of December 31st. 2 billion years ago? That would be around mid-March, back when the planet was just beginning to settle into its routines. The crust was thickening, volcanoes still raged in ways we don't see today. The moon was a little closer, the days a little shorter, the sun a little dimmer, and yet something was happening, deep beneath shallow seas and iron-rich waters. It wasn't always easy to piece this world together. The evidence was scattered, clues tucked into banded iron formations, those striped rocks found in ancient seabeds, where layers of iron and silica alternate like pages in a geological book. Some of these formations were massive, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. For a long time, they were just there. Beautiful, strange, and not entirely understood. But the more geologists looked, the more they realized. These bands were more than rock. They were records, snapshots of a chemical conversation between the oceans and the atmosphere. And something major, had changed during the period when those bands stopped forming. It was as if the planet had switched modes. And the trigger, tiny, invisible, humble creatures, cyanobacteria. They didn't look like much, still don't. Just single-celled microbes drifting lazily in shallow seas soaking up sunlight. But they were about to become the greatest terraformers Earth has ever known. Because these microbes had figured out a trick, something evolution had never tried before. They could perform photosynthesis, and not the kind that just recycles carbon. This was the big version, the one that splits water molecules and releases oxygen as a byproduct. Oxygen sounds like a good thing, and eventually it would be. But at the time, it was dangerous, unwelcome, even lethal. Because Earth's biosphere, its entire cast of living organisms, had evolved in an oxygen-free world. And now, thanks to the quiet bubbling breath of microbes, that world was changing. At first it seemed harmless. The oxygen reacted with iron in the oceans, rusting it into insoluble compounds that sank to the seafloor layer after layer. That's what formed those banded iron formations, alternating phases of oxygenation and stasis. But eventually the iron ran out. The oceans could no longer absorb the oxygen, and so it began to build up. In the water, in the air, everywhere. Today we call it the Great Oxidation Event. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm. No asteroid, no volcano, no monster rising from the depths. Just microbes breathing, day after day, century after century, filling the world with a gas that poisoned nearly every form of life that had come before. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the present, geologists were still putting the pieces together. There were other hints too. Unusual sulfur isotope ratios in ancient rock suggested massive shifts in atmospheric chemistry. The kinds of changes that don't just happen. They need a cause. William Martin, a biologist fascinated by the origin of complex life, pointed to molecular fossils, lipid remnants and chemical biomarkers preserved across eons. Others, like Donald Canfield, argued that oxygenation was staggered, uneven, and more complicated than one single event. And they're probably all right in their way, because the Earth doesn't flip like a light switch. It breathes, it pulses, it shifts in rhythms we're still learning to read. One of the most stunning discoveries came not from chemistry, but from texture. In South Africa's Transvaal supergroup, an expanse of ancient rock that has survived erosion, earthquakes and time itself, researchers found stromatolites. These layered mounds of sediment were formed by microbial mats, and in some cases they still are. Modern stromatolites exist today in a few salty, secluded corners of the globe. But these fossils were from a time before animals, before plants, before anything with nerves or bones or eyes. The shape and structure of these formations spoke to slow, patient life. Microbes living communally, building layer after layer in sunlight, breathing out oxygen, unaware that their metabolic waste was rewriting the rules of the planet. And it's here, standing on outcrops half the world away, staring at rocks older than multicellular life, that modern scientists began to glimpse the scale of what had happened. Not a war, not a catastrophe in the usual sense, but a shift. A long, slow planetary sigh. A transformation so complete it redefined habitability. For a long time, it was hard to even tell this story. There were too many gaps, too few records, rocks that had been folded, metamorphosed, or recycled back into the mantle. But science, like the Earth itself, is persistent. And slowly, from sulfur and iron, From texture and isotope, a picture came into focus. 2 billion years ago, Earth was on the cusp of becoming something new. We think of oxygen as life-giving, but too much oxygen, to the wrong life forms, is toxic. It burns, it corrodes, it interferes with ancient biochemical pathways. And so the very gas that would one day let animals thrive began as a poison, and like many poisons, it didn't just kill, it changed everything. That compass needle, twitching oddly in a Canadian forest, wasn't just reacting to minerals, it was responding to ancient scars, records of magnetic shifts tied to atmospheric transformations, moments when the Earth, quite literally, changed its mind about how it wanted to spin, breathe, and balance itself. Sometimes, discovering the deep past feels like holding a seashell to your ear and hearing not the ocean, but the echoes of a world that once gasped for breath. A world where the sky might have turned a soft violet at sunset, thick with haze, where lightning struck strange chemical clouds, where the seas shimmered with green and purple, not blue, and in the shallows microbial mats quietly exhaled their invisible revolution. It's humbling, isn't it? To realise that Earth's greatest extinction events weren't always explosions, but whispers. That the ground beneath our feet was once ocean floor, rusted by the breath of life. That the atmosphere we take for granted, the one we casually inhale before saying hello, was, for most of the planet's history, an unthinkable luxury. And all of this began with a mystery. A needle that wouldn't point north, a rock that held more than weight, a question that wouldn't go away. Because science, at its heart, is not just about answers, it's about wonder, the kind that follows a twitching compass into a billion-year-old story. To understand what Earth was really like 2 billion years ago, you have to let go of everything familiar. Forget trees. There were none. No forests, no leaves, no roots gripping the soil, because there was barely soil. And without plants, there were no flowers, no bees, no birdsong at dawn. The land, what little of it there was mostly barren, harsh, bleached by sun, battered by wind, and shaped more by lava and weather than by life. There were no animals, nothing with eyes, ears, legs, or even a mouth. No worms tunnelling beneath the surface, no fish gliding through water, no predators, no prey, just microbes, trillions of them. Invisible to the naked eye, but everywhere. In the water, in the mud, clinging to rocks, forming filmy layers that lived, died, and built over themselves like patient architects of a new world. The oceans were vast, shallow in places, deep in others, but they didn't sparkle blue like they do today. They may have been green, or even rusty red in certain regions, stained by iron and sulphur, coloured by the metabolic waste of ancient life. And the sky may not have been blue at all. The idea of a crisp cerulean dome overhead is something we take for granted. But back then, the atmosphere was thick with volcanic gases and haze. Without a protective ozone layer, ultraviolet radiation would have been intense. The air held very little oxygen, just enough perhaps to be dangerous to the organisms that had never evolved to cope with it. Instead of the blue we know today, the sky might have appeared pinkish or orange at certain times of day, especially if methane was abundant. Some researchers believe sunsets could have been ghostly and otherworldly, casting colours we'd struggle to name. The sun itself would have seemed slightly dimmer, its energy output a few percentage points lower than it is now, still enough to warm the planet, but only just. The continents, such as they were, looked different too. Tectonic plates still moved, slowly dragging land masses across the planet's surface. But the arrangement of continents was nothing like the familiar outlines of today. No Americas, no Africa, no Asia or Australia. Instead, cratons, ancient fragments of continental crust, drifted slowly, colliding to form supercontinents that eventually tore themselves apart. Around this time, one such supercontinent may have existed. Nuna, also called Columbia by some geologists, a mostly barren landmass stitched together from the roots of future continents. Not much lived there. Most of the action was in the oceans, and in those oceans something extraordinary was unfolding. Cyanobacteria, tiny, resilient and profoundly influential, were multiplying. Floating in mats, they formed stromatolites, layered structures built over generations, each layer a time capsule, a generation of microbes capturing sunlight, performing photosynthesis, exhaling oxygen and dying, only to be buried beneath the next layer. These structures dotted the shallow coastal shelves like microbial cities, and they worked slowly. So slowly. No tides of revolution, just the steady pulse of chemical transformation. They breathed in carbon dioxide and sunlight. They breathed out oxygen. At first the oxygen didn't linger. It reacted immediately with the vast amounts of dissolved iron in the oceans, oxidizing it into iron oxides that precipitated out of the water and sank to the sea floor. That's what created those famous banded iron formations, rusted stripes in the rock record, like tree rings in stone. But eventually the iron was used up, and the oxygen had nowhere to go. That's when the planet began to change. We don't know exactly what it would have felt like to be on Earth then, if feeling is even the right word. There were no eyes to see, no lungs to breathe, no language to describe it. But we can infer. Temperatures may have been warmer, at least in some regions. Greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide were abundant, creating a potent atmospheric blanket. Yet paradoxically, it's also possible that as oxygen increased, it destabilized the climate. Methane, one of the most powerful greenhouse gases, reacts with oxygen, and as cyanobacteria continued releasing more oxygen, that methane was scrubbed from the atmosphere. Less methane meant less warming. And so, quite suddenly on a geological timescale, the planet may have plunged into an ice age, a brutal one, perhaps even a global one. Some scientists believe this period triggered one of the earliest snowball Earth events, when ice reached all the way to the equator, turning the planet into a frozen marble drifting through space. Others think it was less extreme, a slush ball Earth, where equatorial waters remained unfrozen, but vast ice sheets crept far farther than they do today. Either way, it was a massive shift, and for life, it was catastrophic. Most anaerobic organisms, the ones that thrived without oxygen, were now suffocating in it. Their ancient metabolisms, honed over billions of years in anoxic environments, couldn't cope. Many were poisoned by the very air. Others starved as their food sources collapsed. Imagine a world where your breath is toxic, where your energy source vanishes, where the oceans turn hostile. That was Earth, 2 billion years ago. Not in flames, not in chaos, but quietly transforming in a way that few forms of life could survive. And yet some did. Some bacteria evolved ways to cope with oxygen, to detoxify it, to use it, even to harness its incredible chemical power. Oxygen, as it turns out, is efficient, far more efficient than the chemical energy systems that came before. With it, life could grow bigger, more complex, more daring, but not yet. Back then, life remained simple, mostly prokaryotic, cells without nuclei, no plants, no fungi, no animals, just microbial life, drifting, clinging, spreading. Some were starting to work together, forming colonies, perhaps even experimenting in their tiny way with cooperation. But the multicellular revolution was still hundreds of millions of years away. The oceans were probably stratified, meaning they had distinct chemical layers. The upper layers, exposed to sunlight, were oxygenated. The deeper waters remained anoxic, rich in hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other ancient compounds. If you had a time-travelling submarine and took a dive, you'd pass from breathable water into a realm that would smell of rotten eggs and feel like descending into alien soup. Some of the sulfur-producing bacteria, purple sulfur bacteria for instance, thrived in this twilight zone, just below the reach of oxygen, just above the lifeless abyss. They may have created shimmering, colourful blooms, their pigments painting the water in strange iridescent hues. An ancient ocean rainbow, unseen by any eye. Above them, the surface shimmered under a weaker sun. There were no coral reefs, no schools of fish darting through kelp forests, just microbial mats waving gently in the currents. No tides as we know them, no waves crashing on populated shores, just a quiet world, slowly exhaling, slowly evolving. Geologically, the Earth was restless. Volcanoes were common. Magma surged up through the crust, creating new land, releasing gases, stirring the atmosphere. The balance between carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, and now oxygen was delicate, complex, and ever-shifting. Lightning storms may have been more frequent, not because the Earth was angrier, but because the atmosphere was thicker, denser, charged in different ways, each bolt of lightning a brief, brilliant fracture in the sky, a reminder that even in this quiet world, power was everywhere. And all the while, the Earth rotated a little faster than it does today. Days were shorter, around 18 to 20 hours long. The moon was closer, the tide stronger, the planet still adjusting from the violent birth that had formed it billions of years earlier. This was Earth in transition. Not yet the blue-green jewel we recognise, but no longer the hellish molten sphere it once was. It was something in between, raw, quiet, patient, and it was setting the stage for everything to come. The great oxidation didn't just poison the atmosphere, it laid the groundwork for respiration, for complex chemistry, for the future. The oxygen that once killed would one day allow muscles to contract, brains to spark, hearts to beat. But that future was still so far away it barely shimmered on the horizon. At the time, Earth was simply becoming. We often think of transformation as noisy, dramatic, explosive. But sometimes the most profound changes happen slowly, invisibly, one breath at a time. That was the Earth, 2 billion years ago. The atmosphere was thin and dangerous. The land was mostly bare. The oceans were layered, stained and alive in ways we can barely comprehend. The surface teemed with microbes we'd need a microscope to see, if we could even survive long enough to hold one steady. There were no eyes to witness this world, no songs to mark its passing. But it was real, and it was the beginning of something extraordinary. A planet, learning to breathe. By now, the story feels almost peaceful. A slow-breathing world of microbial mats and quiet chemical changes, drifting under ancient skies. But that calm is deceptive, because beneath it something enormous was brewing. The great oxidation event wasn't a single bang. It was more like a rising tide, gradual, persistent, unstoppable. Oxygen began as a trace gas, a background whisper, quickly absorbed by the ocean's hungry iron. But eventually, inevitably, it outpaced its captors. And when it did, it broke loose. The build-up of oxygen in the atmosphere marked a biochemical revolution. For billions of years, Earth had been an anoxic planet. Life thrived without oxygen, fermenting, reducing, recycling. But cyanobacteria had evolved a trick so powerful it would flip the entire script. They could harvest sunlight and use its energy to split water molecules, and in doing so, they released oxygen, free oxygen, a radical new element in the planetary system. At first, this oxygen didn't linger. It was far too reactive. It crashed into iron, sulfur, methane, anything it could bond with. The oceans were full of ferrous iron, and the oxygen latched onto it like a magnet, oxidizing it into insoluble rust that rained down to the sea floor. This process continued for millions of years. Oxygen in, rust out, over and over, until the iron was all but gone. And then came the turning point. The oxygen had nowhere else to go. It began to accumulate in the atmosphere, first in faint traces, then in measurable amounts. And life, at least life as it existed then, was not ready for that. Anaerobic organisms, the dominant forms of life for 2 billion years, were not just unadapted to oxygen, they were vulnerable to it. Oxygen, for all its benefits to modern metabolism, is also toxic in high concentrations. It creates reactive oxygen species, molecules that damage DNA, rupture membranes, and interfere with fundamental biochemical processes. What we now call oxidative stress was, back then, a death sentence. Oxygen was an uninvited guest in a party that had been going just fine without it. The response was catastrophic. Whole microbial ecosystems collapsed. Sulfate-reducing bacteria, methanogens and other anaerobes retreated into the few remaining anoxic pockets, deep in the ocean, buried in sediments, hidden in the crevices of rocks. Others went extinct entirely, a global extinction, not with fire or impact, but with breath. But this new gas didn't stop at biology. It attacked the atmosphere itself. Oxygen collided with methane, the planet's dominant greenhouse gas, and began stripping it away. Methane, while only a small component of the atmosphere, had been incredibly efficient at trapping heat, far more so than carbon dioxide. It was the reason Earth had stayed warm despite the sun's weaker output, and now, with methane on the decline, the planet began to cool, fast. Geological evidence from this period suggests a dramatic drop in temperature. Glacial deposits, tillites, appear in ancient rock formations across multiple continents, suggesting widespread, possibly even global glaciation. It may have been the first true snowball Earth, a world frozen from pole to pole, oceans sealed under thick layers of ice, equatorial regions wrapped in frost. The cause was chemical. The result was climatic, a chain reaction, all traced back to tiny cells breathing in carbon dioxide and exhaling oxygen. It's strange to think of photosynthesis as a weapon, but in this context, it was. Life turned on itself. By inventing a new way to survive, cyanobacteria accidentally rewrote the rules of existence. Not because they were aggressive or evil, those are human ideas, but because evolution rewards what works, not what's safe. And photosynthesis worked. The oxygen it released not only altered the chemistry of air and water, but also changed the behaviour of the planet's very surface. With oxygen in the atmosphere, new types of weathering began. Rocks eroded differently. Soils began to form in more complex ways. The carbon cycle, the grand planetary system by which carbon moves between air, land, ocean, and life, became more intricate. With oxygen came new chemical pathways. Some carbon was buried as organic material, some was released as CO2, but always the presence of oxygen changed the rhythm of things. Deep in the ocean, changes were unfolding too. The stratified layers of water, oxic above, anoxic below, began to shift. Nutrient availability changed. Microbial ecosystems reorganized. Some species adapted, finding ways to detoxify or even use oxygen. Others vanished, leaving behind molecular fossils and chemical ghosts. And above it all, the sky was changing. Before the great oxidation, the atmosphere was thick with methane and hydrogen sulfide. The air may have carried a reddish haze, coloured by organic aerosols. But as oxygen rose and methane fell, the haze cleared. The sky may have taken on a blue tint for the first time. Not the deep azure of modern skies, but a softer, paler hue. Still, it marked a turning point. A planet once choked in gases was beginning to breathe cleanly. Not comfortably, not yet, but differently. And eventually something new appeared. Ozone. Ozone is just 3 oxygen atoms stuck together, but it's vital. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation, protecting surface life from harmful rays. Without ozone, land remains hostile. With it, the surface becomes habitable. And although true terrestrial life was still far in the future, the building blocks were being laid now in the stratosphere by the invisible hands of chemistry. The Earth was not simply cooling, it was evolving. And all of this, every ice sheet, every dying cell, every shift in the atmosphere, came from the breath of microbes. In Greenland's Isua Greenstone Belt, some of the oldest rocks on Earth hold evidence of this transition. Tiny inclusions, carbon isotopes, sulfur signatures, all whispering the same story. Oxygen was rising. Life was suffocating. The world was changing. Further south, in South Africa and Western Australia, researchers uncovered similar clues. Red beds, oxidized soils, dating back to this era. Their colour a product of iron reacting with free oxygen. On modern Earth, we associate that rust-red hue with deserts or canyons, but back then it was a sign that the air had changed. Fossils from this time are rare. Life was small, soft-bodied and shy about leaving impressions. But geochemistry became the new fossil record, and it told the story clearly. A tipping point had been reached. The system had flipped. Oxygen had gained the upper hand, and it wasn't going away. What followed wasn't a smooth progression toward the world we know. There were setbacks, reversals, perhaps even secondary extinctions. Oxygen levels rose, then fell, then rose again. The climate seesawed. The biosphere staggered through new challenges, but the long arc of change had begun, and at the heart of it, always, was the same mechanism, life changing the planet by simply trying to survive. The air was no longer invisible, not really. It shimmered with consequence. You couldn't see oxygen building in the atmosphere 2 billion years ago, but the planet felt it. The chemistry of Earth had shifted. Its mood had changed. A world that had been chemically predictable for eons suddenly became volatile, reactive, restless. And this restlessness didn't stop at the surface. It moved downward, into the rocks themselves. Buried in ancient sediments, geologists found a sharp signal. What's called a sulfur isotope anomaly. For millions of years, sulfur had cycled through the environment in a particular pattern, shaped by volcanic activity and microbial processing. But then suddenly, that pattern broke. The anomaly vanished. The sulfur cycle had changed, and the only plausible explanation was rising oxygen. It was everywhere now. Not dominant yet, but pervasive. Like a scent that lingered even after the door had closed. And with this rise came strange new feedback loops. Oxygen didn't just scrub methane from the sky, it also interacted with volcanic gases. Sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, all of them reacted differently in this new oxidizing world. Volcanic eruptions began to alter the climate in new ways, contributing not just heat but also cold, depending on the aerosols released. Clouds formed differently. Rain fell with new chemistry. The water cycle itself subtly shifted, shaped now by an atmosphere that carried traces of ozone, free radicals and acids. Meanwhile, in the oceans, life continued its quiet rebellion. Cyanobacteria had thrived in the upper photic zones, those sunlit layers near the surface. But as oxygen accumulated, it began to push downward. Deeper layers of the ocean grew unstable. Hydrogen sulfide, once abundant, began to wane. Anoxic zones contracted. New gradients formed, and in those gradients, evolution found new niches. Some microbes evolved antioxidant enzymes, superoxide dismutus, catalase, molecules designed to neutralize the damaging effects of oxygen. Others retreated into safer corners of the biosphere, deep sea vents, muddy sediments, oxygen-depleted basins, where the chemistry hadn't caught up yet. A few, remarkably, learned to harness oxygen's power, not just detoxify it, but use it. This was the beginning, barely a whisper, of aerobic respiration. The math of it is staggering. Anaerobic processes like fermentation are slow, inefficient, limited. But aerobic respiration, it yields far more energy per unit of fuel. With it, life could grow faster, build bigger structures, perform more complex tasks. But this advantage wouldn't be realized fully for hundreds of millions of years. For now, it was just potential, like a match resting near dry wood. waiting for the spark. And while all of this was unfolding in the shallows, the planet's surface continued its slow tectonic ballet. Supercontinents shifted, cratons collided, the Earth's crust thickened in places, forming new mountain ranges. Subduction zones recycled oceanic plates into the mantle, bringing surface materials into contact with intense heat and pressure, and the deep carbon cycle, the one that governs the exchange of carbon between Earth's surface and its interior, was altered by these new oxygenated conditions. Minerals began to behave differently. New ores formed. The very composition of Earth's crust changed. Even the core may have responded. Some models suggest that the crystallization of Earth's inner core, solidifying within the liquid outer core, may have been influenced by changes in the planet's overall oxidation state. As above, so below. Even in the deepest parts of the planet, the echo of oxygen could be felt. And through all of it, life endured, battered, reduced, cornered, but never entirely extinguished. When the snowball Earth conditions eventually lifted, whether after millions of years or through periodic thawing and refreezing, the survivors emerged into a world that had been permanently altered. The atmosphere had new rules, the oceans held new nutrients, the balance of energy had shifted, and although it would take many eons for multicellular life to arise, the groundwork had been laid, not by force, but by breath. Oxygen hadn't come as a blessing, not at first. It had swept through like a quiet invader. It suffocated, poisoned, oxidized. It collapsed the climate and iced the seas. But it also opened doors that had been closed. Doors to complexity, to energy, to change. It created crises, but also opportunities. This duality would define oxygen forever. Even today it is both essential and dangerous. We breathe it constantly, yet it ages us, damages our cells, slowly wears us down. It gives us fire and rust, metabolism and decay. It is both life-giver and slow thief. And it all began here, in the breathing shallows of a world still figuring itself out. This chapter of Earth's history is written not in bones or teeth or shells, those would come later, but in chemistry, in layers of rock and shifts in isotopes, in the colour of ancient sediments and the fossils of ancient metabolisms. It's a story told not through shape, but through process, and at its heart, always, is the quiet revolution of photosynthesis. What began as a small evolutionary gamble became the engine of planetary transformation, and not just on Earth. Scientists believe that oxygen might be one of the few truly universal biosignatures, something we might detect on exoplanets, should photosynthesis arise elsewhere in the cosmos. That's how far the ripple goes, from one blue-green microbe to an entire world, and still we're learning more. New discoveries come every year. New geochemical models, new microfossils, new theories about the pacing and consequences of this great oxidation. Some argue for a single sharp rise. Others see it as a staggered multi-step evolution. There may have been pulses of oxygenation, each reshaping the biosphere in waves. Others point to feedback loops involving methane-producing microbes and volcanic eruptions. It's a story still being written, but what remains certain is this. 2 billion years ago, the Earth turned a corner. It didn't do it with noise or drama. It did it with microbes and sunlight, with chemistry and time, with a breath that echoed across eras, and in that breath the future was hidden. Not just the oxygen that would someday fill the lungs of trilobites and dinosaurs and astronauts, but the promise of what life could become. Resilient, clever, and just curious enough to dig into ancient rocks and ask, what happened here? When you change the air, you change everything. At first glance, the story seems to end with oxygen rising, methane falling, and life stumbling into a new regime. But the truth is that was only the beginning. Because the great oxidation event didn't just adjust the chemistry of Earth. It set off an intricate web of consequences that rippled through every layer of the planet, from crust to cloud. To picture the aftermath, imagine a quiet world suddenly learning a new language. every process that had once been stable — weather, erosion, carbon cycling, energy flow, microbial metabolism — now had to adapt to an entirely different script. And like any radical rewrite, the early drafts were messy. Start with the oceans. For billions of years they had served as the planet's chemical warehouse, warm, iron-rich, anoxic. They were busy, alive with microbial activity, and deeply stratified. But now, with oxygen creeping into the shallows, their vertical structure began to shift. That delicate layering of oxic surface and anoxic depths became unstable. The balance of gases tipped. Nutrient pathways were rerouted. Entire ecosystems collapsed. It wasn't just the oxygen that did it. It was the cascade it triggered. Methanogens, those ancient microbes that had once filled the atmosphere with methane, were in retreat. Their environments were vanishing. The niches they had held for eons were suddenly toxic. The methane they produced had once blanketed the Earth in warmth, acting as an essential buffer against the weak young sun. Now it was being destroyed faster than it could be made. The result? The Earth began to freeze. Glacial deposits from this era appear in rocks spread across ancient cratons in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. These are not thin, local frostings. They are deep, widespread layers of tillite, rock formed from compacted glacial debris. In some places you find dropstones, rocks carried by icebergs, then dropped into soft ocean sediments as the ice melted. It's the kind of signature you only get from a world that has iced over dramatically. We don't know for certain how global the glaciation was. Some models argue for a full snowball Earth, an ice shell stretching from pole to pole, turning the planet into a gleaming sphere of white. Others favour a slush ball model, where equatorial regions remained at least partially open, keeping a thin ribbon of liquid water for life to cling to. But either way, the planet had changed, permanently. Climate, after all, is not just weather stretched out over time. It is the sum of chemical feedback loops, solar energy balances, planetary albedo, and atmospheric composition. And every one of those things had been altered. The new oxygen-rich air had fewer greenhouse gases. The haze that had once trapped heat was gone. The clouds had changed, perhaps becoming brighter, more reflective. Even the oceans, covered in ice, now reflected sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it. It was as if Earth had accidentally discovered the off switch to its own thermostat. And life had to cope. Some organisms vanished entirely. Others survived by retreating into ecological pockets, hydrothermal vents, brine pools, deep sediments. These places remained warm, chemically buffered, shielded from the sky's new breath. Here the old rules still applied. Here anaerobic metabolisms could persist. But outside those havens, everything else had to adapt or perish. Microbial mats changed composition. New layers formed atop the old. Metabolic pathways evolved under pressure. The rise of antioxidant enzymes marked a quiet arms race against the growing presence of reactive oxygen. Cells that once thrived in calm chemical waters now had to defend themselves against molecular instability. Even basic reproduction had to shift. DNA is fragile in the face of oxygen's fury. Organisms had to invent molecular tools to repair oxidative damage. Some of the earliest versions of modern DNA repair enzymes likely evolved in this era. Not because life wanted to be more complex, but because it had to be tougher. And still, Earth kept spinning. As glaciers scraped across continents, they reshaped the land. They ground down mountains, scooped out valleys, and carried sediments far from their origin. They exposed new rock to the elements, which in turn altered weathering patterns. As fresh rock was weathered by rain and atmospheric carbon dioxide, more carbon was pulled from the sky and stored in sediments. That cooled the planet even further, a feedback loop with no easy exit. Eventually, of course, the planet would thaw. Volcanoes never stopped erupting after all. Over time, their CO2 emissions built up again in the thin air, and with the surface encased in ice, weathering rates dropped, slowing the drawdown of carbon. The balance tipped. The ice began to melt, but the scars of that cold remained, in the rock record, in the genes of survivors, in the metabolic tools life had to invent just to get through it. And when the ice receded, the Earth that emerged was not the same one that had frozen. Now there was ozone in the sky. Now there were oxidized minerals in the soil. Now there were red beds, rusted by air. And the life that remained carried the memory of crisis in its molecules. But the story didn't end with survival. It began to tilt toward opportunity. Because once the immediate chaos of the great oxidation settled, once oxygen levels stabilized, and the climate regained some balance, something remarkable began to happen. New ecological possibilities opened. For the first time, Earth had an atmosphere that could support aerobic respiration. It wasn't common yet. Most organisms still used older, less efficient methods, but here and there, in pockets and pools, cells began experimenting. The numbers tell the tale. Anaerobic fermentation yields only 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. Aerobic respiration, up to 36. It was a game changer. More energy meant more work could be done inside each cell. More work meant greater complexity. New structures, new behaviours. It would take time. A lot of it. Hundreds of millions of years, in fact, before anything resembling multicellular life would emerge. But the first domino had already fallen, and oxygen had pushed it. Still, Earth wasn't done shifting. Because alongside these biological changes came geological ones. The oxidation of iron-rich minerals created whole new classes of ore deposits. Banded iron formations declined as iron became less soluble in oxygenated water. Instead, new sedimentary environments emerged, with oxidized soils and different sediment chemistry. The surface of the planet was being painted anew. Even tectonics was touched. Some geologists believe that the rise of atmospheric oxygen influenced the strength and composition of the continental crust. More oxidized conditions may have affected how minerals crystallized in cooling magma. It's subtle, complex, and debated. But like so many things in Earth science, everything connects. And through it all, the sky changed colour. It's not easy to reconstruct the colour of an ancient sky. We can't bottle the air from 2 billion years ago. But by modelling its composition, methane, CO2, nitrogen, oxygen, we can infer how light scattered through it. Before oxygen, the sky may have had a yellow-orange cast tinged by hydrocarbon haze like Saturn's moon Titan. But after, as ozone formed and aerosols declined, the atmosphere began to scatter shorter wavelengths. Blue emerged, soft at first, then deeper. The sky became familiar, but no one was there to see it. There were no eyes yet, no faces lifted to the heavens, no minds to wonder at the colour, just microbes, drifting, dividing, enduring. It would be eons before anyone could look back on this moment and call it what it truly was, a planetary reboot. The world that re-emerged from the chill was cautious. Oxygen didn't flood the planet overnight. It crept. It rose in pulses, sometimes retreating, sometimes surging. It may have taken hundreds of millions of years before it reached even a small fraction of what we breathe today. But it was enough. Enough to keep reshaping the biosphere. Enough to ensure that the damage was done, and the possibilities unlocked. The oceans, once dominated by methane and hydrogen sulfide, slowly changed their chemistry. Oxygen-rich waters brought with them new minerals, new solubilities, new balances. Some regions saw blooms of new microbial life, while others fell eerily silent. Once thriving anoxic basins reduced to sterile sludge. And with the new oxygen came something strange in the deep sea. Phosphorus. It's one of the essential ingredients of life, but it behaves differently depending on the oxygen content of water. In anoxic environments, phosphorus tends to bind tightly to particles and sink out of reach. But in oxygenated waters, it remains more bioavailable, easier for life to access. More phosphorus meant more productivity, more biomass, more carbon to bury. And the more organic carbon you bury, the more oxygen is left behind in the atmosphere. Another feedback loop, the system fed itself. And that might explain how the Great Oxidation wasn't just a one-time pulse, but a slow ratchet. A cycle of forward motion, collapse and rebound, each swing leaving behind a slightly more oxidized Earth. It wasn't smooth, there were hiccups, dips, possible reversals. Some periods may have even seen oxygen vanish almost completely from the air again, pushed back by volcanic gases or bursts of methane. But the general trend was clear, up, and not just in air, but in expectation. Life had tasted a new kind of energy, one that demanded more of it, but gave more in return. Deep within the genetic memory of surviving microbes, traces of this revolution can still be found. Genes for oxidative stress resistance, enzymes that wouldn't have made sense in an anoxic world. Even the earliest versions of mitochondria, the tiny organelles that would one day power animal cells, may have originated here, in this crucible of oxygen and adaptation. It's believed that somewhere around this time, one microbe engulfed another, not to eat it, but to borrow its power. A tiny partnership was formed, a host cell and a bacterium that could handle oxygen. That bacterium over time became the mitochondrion. It's a familiar origin story now, but back then it was just another gamble in a world full of risk. That gamble would eventually lead to complex cells, eukaryotes, the kind that build tissues, form organs and write poetry. But those were still far in the future. For now, the Earth remained microbial, its drama quiet, its actors small. But the stage was set. The ripple effects of this event didn't just stay local. They echoed into every system. In the lithosphere, the rocky shell of the planet, new minerals began to appear. Geologists have catalogued a significant increase in mineral diversity following the Great Oxidation event. Before oxygen, fewer than 1,500 distinct minerals existed. After, over 4,000. Why? Because oxygen is reactive. It forms new compounds, it binds, breaks, recombines, it creates colour, variety, complexity. Even gems were born in this new world. Many of the vibrant colours we associate with minerals, reds, greens, blues, are the result of oxidation states. Earth's palette expanded simply because the air had changed. In the atmosphere, ozone continued to gather, and with it came protection. Ultraviolet light, once a deadly force that sterilised any land it touched, was now filtered out more effectively. It's likely that some UV still got through. Early ozone wasn't as dense as it is today, but it marked the beginning of Earth's habitability at the surface. That was crucial, because without it, life would remain ocean-bound forever. The cryosphere, the realm of ice, also bore the marks. Glacial periods had come and gone before, but the ones triggered by oxygen's rise were different. They involved new dynamics, new pacing, new chemistry. Some models suggest that entire ice cycles changed frequency after this event, as atmospheric composition played a more complex role in Earth's energy balance. Even the magnetosphere, the magnetic shield that protects Earth from solar radiation, may have responded in subtle ways. The cooling of the planet, driven by oxygen's assault on greenhouse gases, may have influenced convection patterns in the mantle. That, in turn, could have affected how heat flowed from the core, impacting the geodynamo and the strength of Earth's magnetic field. It's a speculative connection, but one worth pondering. When the air changes, even the planet's invisible defences might shift. And then, of course, there was time. Not just geological time, but evolutionary time. The pace of evolution is hard to measure. It doesn't tick like a clock. It pulses, accelerates, stalls. But oxygen gave life something new, an energy surplus. And evolution, like any builder, works faster with more tools. It's no coincidence that the earliest fossils of eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, with mitochondria, with internal scaffolding, start appearing in the wake of the Great Oxidation, They didn't take over immediately. Simpler life forms still ruled the world for another billion years, but the signal had been sent. Complexity was now possible, and with it, eventual diversity. It's strange to think that death made this possible, that entire branches of the tree of life had to wither so others could grow. But that's how ecosystems work. Extinction clears space, it resets conditions, it forces invention. And invention, slow though it may be, is relentless. So the world, in its quiet way, adapted. Microbes didn't just survive, they flourished in the new oxygen gradients. Some became mixotrophs, using both oxygen and anaerobic processes. Others retreated to stable niches, deep sediments, anoxic basins, hot springs. These refugees would remain, preserving ancient metabolisms for billions of years. Even today you can find them, in the Black Sea, in deep ocean trenches, in the guts of cows, little echoes of a pre-oxygen world. And in the geological record the memory lingered too, shales rich in organic carbon, red beds stained with oxidized iron, trace fossils of microbial mats that danced in the shallow tides. Even the sedimentation rates changed, new types of clays formed, carbonates shifted in composition. The planet was painting its autobiography page by page with tools it had never used before. And no one was watching, no intelligence, no culture, no myths, just a planet, becoming something new. Every breath of oxygen whispered a different future, one where cells could grow larger, communicate, specialize, one where metabolism could reach higher gears, one where life would someday walk, think, wonder. But for now, it simply endured. The Earth of 2 billion years ago was a place of transition, not quite hostile, not yet hospitable. It was between stories, a planet mid-sentence. And that's what makes this chapter so extraordinary. Not the drama of mass extinction, not the suddenness of a cataclysm, but the long, slow cascade of cause and effect, the chain of quiet upheavals, the whispers that became revolutions. It wasn't loud, but it was total. Oxygen, once a byproduct, had become a planet shaper, a sculptor of climate, life, rock, and possibility. And in doing so, it etched a truth into the very bones of Earth. Change doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it just breathes. If you look at Earth's history as a tapestry, the Great Oxidation event is a bold, strange stitch, a sudden shift in colour that pulls the eye, a moment when the pattern changed direction. But it wasn't the beginning, nor would it be the last of its kind. Earth, after all, has always been a restless artist, tearing up old canvases, layering new paints, rewriting the image again and again. To understand what happened 2 billion years ago, you have to travel even further back, to a time before oxygen, before the sun's light was strong, before the crust had fully formed. Earth's first billion years were chaotic, violent, formative. This period is known as the Hadean and Archean eons, a time when the planet was molten, the sky choked with volcanic gases, and oceans first condensed from steam. There were no continents yet, only shifting protocontinental islands bobbing in a global sea. Life, as we understand it, had not yet arrived, or had just begun tentatively hidden in hydrothermal vents or warm, mineral-rich puddles. And yet, even then, the seeds of the future were being sown. Microbial life may have emerged as early as 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. Simple, single-celled, built from chemistry and chance. We don't know exactly how life began, whether sparked by lightning, catalyzed by minerals, or carried by comet. But by 3.5 billion years ago, it had left behind traces. Stromatolites from Western Australia and South Africa stand as fossilized monuments to these early organisms, microbial mats that built themselves up, layer by layer, in warm, shallow waters. They were anaerobes, these pioneers, thriving without oxygen, relying instead on sulfur, hydrogen and methane. They built complex metabolisms in a world that, to us, would be utterly toxic. And for more than 1 billion years, they were the only show in town. This was Earth's first stability, a microbial empire in a chemically rich, low-oxygen world. But like all stability, it carried within it the possibility of change. Photosynthesis didn't arrive all at once. It was likely preceded by simpler forms, anoxygenic photosynthesis, where light was used to drive reactions that didn't produce oxygen. Green and purple sulfur bacteria still perform this kind of photosynthesis today. But at some point, perhaps around 2.7 billion years ago, cyanobacteria developed the full version, the one that split water, the one that breathed oxygen. And with that, the clock began ticking. The Great Oxidation event some 2.4 billion years ago wasn't an isolated explosion. It was the result of a long fuse, hundreds of millions of years of quiet build-up, chemical buffering, biological push and pull. It was preceded by whispers, false starts, and partial oxygenations. It may have flared once, receded, then surged again, and what came after it was not peace. Earth has experienced at least 5 major mass extinction events, and many smaller ones. The Great Oxidation was among the earliest, and its death toll may rival any that followed. But unlike an asteroid or a supervolcano, it was caused by life itself. That's a theme that will repeat. Fast forward 1 billion years, and you find another great oxygenation, sometimes called the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event. This second breath came roughly 800 to 600 million years ago, and may have finally pushed oxygen levels close to what we experience today. It coincided with the rise of multicellular organisms, including some of the first animals, soft-bodied, strange, and unlike anything alive now. And just like before, oxygen seems to have played both saviour and executioner. Some lineages thrived, others vanished. The balance of ecosystems was reshaped. Complexity bloomed, not smoothly, but in bursts. This pattern would echo through the rest of Earth's history. The Cambrian explosion, about 541 million years ago, ushered in a sudden, astonishing diversification of life. New body plans, new organs, new senses, eyes, jaws, nervous systems. It was as if life, given enough oxygen and time, suddenly learned how to build anything. But just over 100 million years later, the Ordovician-Silurian extinction struck. Then came the late Devonian extinction, the Permian-Triassic Great Dying, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, and the famous end Cretaceous asteroid strike that ended the age of dinosaurs. Each extinction had its own cause: volcanism, climate change, asteroid impact, ocean anoxia. But many shared a common thread: disruption to the carbon and oxygen cycles. When oxygen falls or rises too fast, when carbon is suddenly released or buried, when temperature jumps or plummets, life struggles. Balance is delicate, feedbacks are complex, and Earth, it seems, is prone to overcorrections. The Great Oxidation was simply the first big swing in this cycle. It set the precedent. It showed that life could change the world, and the world could push back. It introduced a new kind of ecological tension between stability and innovation, between chemistry and biology, between life and its own byproducts. And this cycle didn't just shape life, it shaped us. The oxygen in your blood, the iron in your cells, the carbon in your bones, they all trace their lineage to these ancient fluctuations. The mitochondria powering your thoughts, the air filling your lungs, the minerals in your diet, all born in a dance between life and planet, repeated again and again. Even today we are part of that rhythm. Modern climate change is not the first time Earth has faced rapid shifts in carbon and oxygen, but it is the first time one species has been so aware of its role. We burn ancient carbon, re-release long-buried gases, warm the air, melt the ice, acidify the seas, and we do it with full knowledge of the consequences. That makes us strange participants in Earth's story, not passengers, but drivers. And the echoes of the great oxidation are still with us, in the isotopes we study, in the ores we mine, in the legacy of metabolism, in the resilience and fragility of ecosystems, in the knowledge that what once took millions of years, breath by breath, can now be shifted by combustion, deforestation and policy. Patterns repeat, cycles return. But the shapes they take are never quite the same. Earth doesn't forget. It records everything in stone, in ice, in atmosphere, in gene. The banded iron formations that once signalled the first oxygenation still lie beneath our feet, mined for steel, admired for beauty, and studied for their strange rust-coloured layers. They are pages in the planet's memory, written by the simplest of organisms, telling the most complex of stories. And within that story, there are other pulses, other experiments. There's the faint young sun paradox, the mystery of how early Earth stayed warm despite a weaker sun. The solution, it turns out, was greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide, balanced by life and weathering. When that balance broke, ice followed. When ice retreated, oxygen surged. When oxygen surged, life changed. There's the burial of organic carbon, how it allowed oxygen to accumulate. There's the sulfur cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the role of trace metals in enzyme function, the invention of sex, the rise of predation, the evolution of complex multicellularity, all part of the same mosaic. Each event, a layer, each layer, a step. Not toward a goal, but toward possibility. This is what Earth does. It experiments, it destroys and builds, it cycles, it remembers. And life, in all its forms, adapts. From the first breath of oxygen to the first breath drawn by lungs, from the rusting of oceans to the rust in our blood, from the slow freezing of an ancient world to the melting of glaciers under modern skies. We're not separate from these cycles, we're made of them. And when we study them, we are not just peering into the past, we are looking in a mirror. We often think of deep time as something unreachable, something vast and impersonal, written in stone and silence. But every so often, it speaks, and when it does, it's not through thunder or fire, but through people. Curious, persistent people. Scientists with boots muddied by riverbanks, fingers smudged with rock dust, eyes squinting at strata under a cold sun. They are the interpreters of Earth's memory, and their stories are part of the story too. The tale of the great oxidation event didn't begin in a lab or a textbook. It began in the field, among cliffs and canyons, outcrops and drill cores, places where the past isn't an idea, but something you can touch. In the 1920s, a geologist named Lawrence L. Sloss was studying the sedimentary layers of the Midwestern United States. What he noticed, though he didn't yet have the full context, was that these layers weren't random. They had patterns, sequences, rhythms. His work laid the groundwork for what would become sequence stratigraphy, the study of how sediment layers reflect ancient environments and sea level changes. It wasn't about oxygen yet, but it was about listening to the planet's buried rhythms. Elsewhere, in South Africa, geologists were puzzling over something different. Banded iron formations, those striking layered rocks of red and grey, were turning up across the Kapval Craton, one of the oldest pieces of Earth's continental crust. The bands were consistent, repeating, beautiful. At first they were just a curiosity, but soon they became a puzzle. Why did they stop forming around 1.8 billion years ago? What changed in the oceans to end this process so suddenly? That question lingered for decades, and in Canada, on the ancient rocks of the Canadian Shield, similar questions were being asked. The rocks told a story of oxidation, of iron being stripped from the oceans and locked into sediment. But how? Enter Preston Cloud. A paleontologist with a poetic name and a restless mind, Cloud was one of the first to frame the Great Oxidation as a biological event. In the 1960s and 70s, he argued that photosynthetic microbes, cyanobacteria, were not just passive participants in Earth's story. They were agents of change. Life, he suggested, could alter the planet's chemistry. The biosphere wasn't just reacting to the environment, it was shaping it. It was a radical idea at the time. Up until then, Earth science and biology had often been treated as separate worlds. One dealt with rocks, the other with cells. But Cloud's work helped blur that line. He saw no reason why microbes couldn't be planet-scale engineers, and he was right. Later, in the 1980s, Donald Canfield took this idea further. A geochemist with a sharp eye for detail, Canfield studied sulfur isotopes in ancient rocks. What he found was strange, a signal that disappeared suddenly, worldwide, around the same time as the Great Oxidation. This disappearance suggested a shift in the way sulfur moved through the environment, a global change, something big. From this, the Canfield ocean hypothesis emerged, the idea that after the initial rise of oxygen in the atmosphere, the deep oceans remained anoxic for hundreds of millions of years, rich instead in hydrogen sulfide. It was a world in transition, oxygen above, poison below, and life caught in between. Canfield's insights opened a new way of thinking about ancient oceans, not as static, but as layered, complex, evolving systems. He helped us see that Earth doesn't change all at once. It pulses, it adapts in stages. Meanwhile, in the labs of the late 20th century, others were developing tools to look back more precisely than ever before. Isotope geochemistry, once a niche specialty, became central. Scientists learned to read the fingerprints of oxygen, carbon, sulfur, and iron, locked inside minerals. These fingerprints told stories no fossil ever could, of redox conditions, biological activity, and ancient atmospheres. One of these tools was the mass spectrometer, a machine that could weigh atoms with astonishing precision. With it, geologists could measure tiny differences in isotope ratios, not enough to notice with the eye, but enough to say, this rock formed in a world with oxygen, or this sediment came from a methane-rich sea. And so, piece by piece, the narrative came together. It wasn't just about when oxygen rose, it was about how, where, why, and most importantly, what it did. Scientists travelled the globe to find those answers, to places like the Pilbara Craton in Western Australia, where stromatolites still grow today, much like they did billions of years ago. To the Gunflint Formation in Canada, where microfossils lie preserved in chert, their outlines whispering of ancient cells. To the Transvaal supergroup in South Africa, where the layers stretch back in time like a library of stone. In the 1990s and early 2000s, new techniques like UPB radiometric dating added even more resolution. Suddenly, geologists could date events not just to the nearest 100 million years, but within a few million. That may sound imprecise by human standards, but in geologic time, it's as close to a wristwatch as we get. And still, the mysteries grew deeper. Why did oxygen rise when it did? Why not sooner? Or later? Some researchers, like Roger Buick and Ariel Anbar, began probing these questions through a different lens, looking not just at biology, but at tectonics, volcanism, and the delivery of nutrients like phosphorus and molybdenum to the oceans. These trace metals, it turned out, played a crucial role in microbial metabolism. Without them, photosynthesis could stall, respiration could falter. The question became more complex, not just who breathed first, but what else had to be in place for breath to change the world? Science became a collaborative story. Chemists, geologists, biologists, climatologists, all tracing different threads of the same tapestry. Fieldwork met theory, lab work met chance, and through it all, the slow realization grew. The Great Oxidation wasn't just a singular event, it was a threshold, a planetary shift written into the rocks, decoded by minds bold enough to ask, and it didn't stop at discovery. Because the people drawn to these questions, the geologists, paleobiologists, isotope wizards, and field-stained wanderers, were not just scientists, they were storytellers. They saw time not as a straight line, but as something that loops, folds, shimmers. They listened to silence and heard breath. They picked up a stone and read it like a sentence, and sometimes they disagreed. Science thrives on friction. Some argued for a sharp oxygenation, a global flip. Others insisted on a staggered rise, with oxygen sneaking in through back doors, building in pulses and plateaus. Some thought tectonics was the key, mountain building delivering nutrients to the sea. Others blamed biology alone. Still others pointed to methane collapse, to orbital cycles, to ocean stratification, and they're still debating. Because science doesn't chase certainty, it chases understanding. It's okay if the answers shift. What matters is that the questions stay alive. As the 21st century arrived, the search for answers didn't stop in the field. It moved into laboratories, places filled not with sunlight and stone, but with glowing screens, chilled centrifuges, and machines humming quietly in the dark. Scientists began simulating ancient oceans in flasks and tanks. They recreated early atmospheres in gas chambers. They engineered microbes to test how metabolism might have functioned 2 billion years ago. And in doing so, they found something astonishing. Even the simplest bacteria are incredibly good chemists. In a lab at Arizona State University, researchers fed microbes ancient diets, iron, sulfur, trace metals, and watched them build modern molecules. At MIT, isotope labs dissected the whispers locked in sediment cores pulled from the Arctic and the deep Pacific. On every continent, the rocks of the past were re-examined under modern lenses. Mass spectrometers grew sharper. Microscopes reached nanoscale clarity. DNA sequencing entered the game. And what it revealed was humbling. Many of the genes that help us breathe, enzymes that manage oxygen, proteins that build mitochondria, have roots going back billions of years. Not just in cyanobacteria, but in their cousins, their competitors, even in lineages that should have disappeared but somehow found a way to survive. Evolution, it turns out, doesn't like to waste a good idea, and the more we looked, the more ideas we found. In the cold of Antarctica, researchers found microbes still living beneath the ice, metabolizing slowly, quietly, perhaps not so unlike their ancestors during Earth's frozen phases. In hydrothermal vents, bacteria thrive in complete darkness, using chemical energy instead of sunlight. In deep boreholes drilled miles below ground, whole microbial communities persist in rock pores, surviving on hydrogen, sulfur, and time. These aren't just outliers, they're windows. They show us what life is capable of, and what it's capable of surviving, and that's when the search for ancient oxygen reached beyond Earth. Because if oxygen is a planetary signature, a biosignature, then maybe, just maybe, it could be detected somewhere else. Not in rocks this time, but in light. Astronomers began pointing telescopes at distant stars, watching as exoplanets passed in front of them. The starlight that filters through a planet's atmosphere can be broken apart, split into spectra, and analysed for chemical fingerprints. In that faint light, we look for oxygen. And in doing so, the questions circle back. Could photosynthesis arise elsewhere? Would it look the same? Would it use water and sunlight, or invent an entirely different strategy? Would it build oxygen, rust oceans, freeze the sky? Or would it follow an alien path, unfamiliar yet parallel? The study of Earth's deep past, of the great oxidation event, the rise and fall of gases, the long arc of microbial persistence, suddenly became astrobiology. Because the story of our planet isn't just ours, it's an example, a case study, a possibility. And that possibility stretches far beyond our skies. Yet even here, on Earth, the work continues. You'll still find scientists hiking into ancient formations, carrying rock hammers and notebooks, pausing at outcrops that haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years. You'll find others behind laptops, modelling ancient climates on supercomputers. You'll find a quiet hum in isotope labs, as samples run through machines so sensitive they can detect a single atom's mass difference. And all of them are listening for the breath of Earth, the shift in sulphur, the rust of ancient seas, the memory of a world that almost froze itself silent. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they agree, but always they wonder. They wonder what came before. They wonder what comes next. Because the Great Oxidation event didn't just change the planet, it changed what questions we ask. It taught us that life and Earth are not separate, that biology and geology are a conversation, that every breath carries history, and that the most important revolutions don't always arrive with fire and noise, but with patience, sunlight, and time. So the story continues, not in final answers, but in the people still asking, still digging, still picking up rusted rocks and asking, what was this world like before air? And quietly, patiently the Earth answers, layer by layer, atom by atom, breath by breath. To understand an ancient world, you have to ask quiet questions. What did the oceans taste like before fish? How red was the iron before it sank? How do you measure air that no longer exists? These aren't riddles. They're problems that science tackles daily, with patience, with strange tools, and with imagination. And while the past may be gone, its chemistry lingers, locked in minerals, trapped in isotopes, etched into the invisible dance between electrons and atoms. That's where deep science begins, with the unseen. Geochemistry, for instance, is a language written in ratios. It doesn't look like poetry, but in many ways it's more precise. When a volcano erupts, or a microbe breathes, or a planet cools, it leaves chemical footprints. And even billions of years later, those footprints can be traced. Take sulphur. It's one of Earth's most social elements. It forms bonds easily, moves between rock, water and air, and plays a starring role in metabolism. But sulphur also comes in different isotopes, same element, slightly different mass. Under certain conditions, particularly in an oxygen-free atmosphere, sulphur behaves in odd ways. It splits isotopes unevenly, creating what scientists call mass-independent fractionation. That's a fancy way of saying sulphur got weird, and then one day it stopped getting weird. That disappearance is a signal. It's as if Earth crossed a threshold. Once the atmosphere became oxygen-rich, sulphur chemistry changed, and that strange isotope behaviour vanished from the rock record. You can find the moment it happened, like a chemical switch flipping. And that's how we know something fundamental in the sky had changed. Geochemists don't need fossils to see this. They just need a thin slice of rock, a laser, and a mass spectrometer. That's enough to read a story written 2.4 billion years ago in molecules. Or look at iron. In an anoxic ocean, iron is soluble. It stays dissolved invisibly like sugar in tea. But add oxygen and it rusts. It forms iron oxides, tiny particles that fall like red snow to the seafloor. That's how banded iron formations were made. Layers of rust and silica, laid down in rhythmic pulses, perhaps seasonal, perhaps storm-driven, perhaps tied to biological blooms. Geochemists analyse the oxidation states of iron in these layers. They measure iron to aluminum ratios, or track the isotopic fractionation caused by biological versus chemical oxidation. Some of these methods are so sensitive, they can detect a shift caused by microbial metabolism rather than simple chemical weathering. This is what deep science does. It reads beyond the obvious. Even the rocks you'd think are too dull to matter, grey shales, fine clays, are treasure maps. They contain organic carbon, fossilised not as bone or shell, but as molecular ghosts. the leftovers of ancient life. The carbon can tell us how much productivity existed in ancient seas. It can even hint at what kinds of metabolisms were most common. The ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12, for example, reflects biological processing. Photosynthesis prefers carbon-12, so if you see a sudden drop in carbon-13, it's a sign that lots of photosynthesis and possibly burial was happening. That, in turn, affects oxygen levels. And the cycle continues. In deep science, every element is part of a conversation. Molybdenum, for instance, is barely known outside of science, but in ancient oceans it played a critical role. It's a cofactor for nitrogen-fixing enzymes, and its presence, or absence, tells us something about the redox state of seawater. In anoxic oceans, molybdenum becomes scarce. In oxygenated ones, it accumulates. So if you see molybdenum enrichment in shale, you're looking at oxygen's footprint in the sea. Uranium behaves similarly. So does chromium. Trace metals, barely present in parts per billion, become sentinels. Their chemistry is like a diary the ocean forgot to hide. But there's more than chemistry. There's also time. And for that, science turns to radiometric dating. It's not enough to know that something happened. You have to know when. And you have to know it precisely. That's where isotopes of uranium and lead come in. Zircons, tiny crystals formed in volcanic rocks, trap uranium when they grow, but not lead. Over time, uranium decays into lead at a known rate. So by measuring how much lead has accumulated and how much uranium remains, scientists can determine the age of the crystal. These methods have dated some rocks to over 4 billion years old. Imagine that, holding a speck of crystal in your hand, knowing it formed before oxygen, before continents, before almost anything we recognize. Other dating methods use samarium and neodymium, rubidium and strontium, potassium and argon. Each has its window, its strengths, its purpose. Together, they create a layered clock, ticking quietly across Earth's deep past. But dating isn't just about numbers, it's about sequence, correlation, context. One rock may be 2.48 billion years old, another 2.4. But between them, the chemistry flips. The sulfur isotopes change, the iron disappears, the carbon spikes. That sequence tells a story. That story reveals transition. And that transition, if consistent across continents, becomes a global event. The Great Oxidation wasn't defined by fossils or ice. It was defined by isotopes, by whispers in stone, and still science dives deeper. Now we have climate models, supercomputers running simulations of early Earth, testing how sunlight, greenhouse gases, cloud cover and ocean circulation interacted. These models tell us how a drop in methane could lead to a global freeze, how a pulse of volcanism might reset the climate, how the strange tilt of ancient Earth could affect seasonality, ocean mixing, biological productivity. Some models even simulate entire microbial ecosystems. They predict where photosynthetic mats might thrive, how oxygen would diffuse through sediments, how feedback loops could amplify or suppress chemical changes. We don't have a time machine, but we have math. And math, guided by data, builds time machines of a different kind. Then there's paleobiology, a field that stretches the definition of life to include molecular fossils. Some of the earliest biosignatures are not shapes, but compounds, lipids, pigments, enzymes. Molecular remnants, stable enough to survive deep burial, sometimes even metamorphism. Sterines, for instance, are markers of eukaryotic cells. Hopanes suggest bacterial life. Specific ratios of biomarkers can indicate whether an environment was oxygen-rich or not, whether the microbes were purple sulfur bacteria or cyanobacteria, whether the sea was stratified, whether the bottom was toxic. In a way, it's forensic science, but for a planet. Paleobiologists don't always get to see the organism, but they see its effects, its metabolism, its waste, its shadow. And then there's genetics. Molecular clock analysis. a technique that compares the mutation rates of DNA sequences, can estimate when key genes evolved. It's not perfect, and it depends on calibration points, but it offers a new axis of data. We now think that the gene for oxygenic photosynthesis may have evolved long before oxygen built up in the air. The tools were there, but the world wasn't ready. Why? Maybe the oceans were too rich in reducing agents. Maybe plate tectonics hadn't yet delivered the right nutrients. Maybe the burial of organic carbon wasn't efficient enough to allow oxygen to accumulate. Whatever the reason, the genes came first. The atmosphere followed. It's a reminder that life's innovations don't always change the world right away. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they need help. From a volcano, a glacier, a slow shift in the continents. Earth is not a simple system. It's layered, non-linear, recursive. A change in the ocean affects the sky. A shift in rock chemistry alters microbial metabolism. A tiny cell, buried in mud, might change the future of the planet, if it lives long enough. And through all of it, deep science watches, measures, models, revises. It knows that the past isn't static. It shifts, depending on how we look at it. New tools reveal new clues. New data challenge old assumptions. A trace metal once dismissed as noise becomes a signal. A forgotten outcrop becomes the key to a puzzle we didn't even know we had. And slowly, the story deepens. As Earth's deep science unravelled layer after layer of its ancient breath, a surprising thing happened. Our questions about the past started pointing to the stars. Because if oxygen was a signature of life here, sculpted by microbes, layered into rocks, woven through isotopes, could it also be a beacon, visible from light years away? That's the premise behind astrobiology, a field born from the union of geology, chemistry, astronomy, and deep curiosity. It asks a simple question with profound implications. What does life look like when we're too far away to see it? And one answer, again and again, is oxygen. The idea is elegant. If you detect oxygen in a planet's atmosphere, especially in large quantities, and you can rule out non-biological sources like photolysis or unusual volcanic activity, then something is likely producing it. And on Earth, that something has always been life, not intelligence, not civilization, just photosynthesis, microbes. The same cyanobacteria that rusted the oceans, froze the planet and rewrote the atmosphere. Those are the potential torchbearers of life's visibility from afar. That's how deep the great oxidation event reaches, not just backward into time, but outward into space. It reframes how we see ourselves. Because now, astronomers and planetary scientists use Earth's ancient chemistry as a filter when scanning distant worlds. The James Webb Space Telescope, for instance, doesn't just take pretty pictures. It dissects the atmospheres of exoplanets, looking for spectral lines that indicate gases like methane, water vapour, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. But here's the challenge. Oxygen can be misleading. It's reactive. It doesn't last in an atmosphere unless something keeps replenishing it. So finding oxygen is meaningful, but it's not everything. You have to find it in context, with other gases, in the right ratios, under conditions that hint at imbalance. Because life is messy. It disrupts. It creates chemical chaos that no purely geological process maintains. So the models evolve. Scientists simulate exoplanet climates, photochemistry, volcanic cycling, and stellar influence. They ask whether a rocky planet orbiting a red dwarf could accumulate abiotic oxygen from UV light. They test whether methane and oxygen could coexist without some kind of biological tug-of-war. All of this science, cutting-edge, futuristic, deeply mathematical, rests on the shoulders of what Earth has already taught us. We are, in many ways, using Earth's deep past as a Rosetta Stone for alien atmospheres. And the reverse is also true. By trying to imagine alien biospheres, we learn more about what's possible here. Could there have been other forms of photosynthesis? Other metabolisms that left fainter traces? Could oxygenation have played out differently on another version of Earth? These questions bounce between disciplines: geobiology, atmospheric physics, origin of life chemistry, and land right back where we started, with breath and time and change. But the deep science isn't just looking out, it's also looking inward, even deeper. There's Earth system modelling, which takes every known feedback loop, biological, chemical, climatic, and tries to simulate how the planet behaves. These models show how oxygen interacts with CO2, how tectonics affects nutrient delivery, how microbial ecosystems influence atmospheric composition. They are sensitive to tiny things: the erosion rate of a single mountain chain, the burial rate of organic carbon in one shallow basin, the sulfur content of one volcanic arc. They let us run experiments Earth itself took millions of years to complete. We can simulate snowball Earth events. We can test how much methane needs to disappear to cause glaciation. We can play out what-if scenarios. What if cyanobacteria had never evolved? What if tectonics had stalled? What if the early sun had been slightly dimmer or slightly hotter? These aren't just hypotheticals, they are scaffolding. They help us understand what made Earth just right, and how close it came to being otherwise. Even now, in labs around the world, researchers build miniature oceans. They fill glass columns with ancient seawater recipes, layer in microbes, control light levels, track oxygen diffusion. These are bioreactors, and they are like tiny time machines. They let us watch photosynthesis rise in slow motion. Let us test which minerals form under which redox gradients. Let us measure the output of a single microbial mat under simulated Archean skies. It is meticulous work, but it adds weight to the stories we tell. And then there are the field expeditions, those never stop. Geologists still hike across the Pilbara Craton, chipping samples from stromatolite reefs 3.5 billion years old. Still sift through the Gunflint Formation, looking for preserved microfossils in chert. Still analyse shale sequences in South Africa, Greenland, Russia. Anywhere the ancient surface of Earth still whispers. The questions remain the same. The tools just get sharper. And in those samples, sometimes, we find something strange. A microfossil whose shape suggests a cell wall, an isotope anomaly that doesn't match known cycles, a layer of clay rich in iridium or rare earth elements. These are clues, open doors. Some will lead nowhere, others will rewrite chapters, because deep science doesn't end, it loops. Every answer leads to a better question. Every pattern hides a sub-pattern. Every rock holds more than one meaning. Even the most established truths, oxygen came from photosynthesis, the rise was around 2.4 billion years ago, are nuanced. Was the rise sudden, staggered, global? Did oxygen rise in the air first, or in localized ocean regions? How much was actually breathable? Were there multiple pulses? Some scientists argue that the term Great Oxidation Event is misleading, that it wasn't a single event at all but a prolonged transition, with lulls and surges and reversals. Others argue that we focus too much on oxygen and not enough on the other gases, the ones that fell when oxygen rose. Because that's another truth of deep science. The story is never just about one thing. It's about methane disappearing. It's about CO2 dropping, ice expanding, iron rusting, sulfur shifting, and life finding new paths through new chemical terrain. It's about Earth as a living system. Not just life on Earth, but Earth itself behaving like a living organism, reacting, adapting, regulating. That idea, the Gaia hypothesis, was once fringe. Now, aspects of it are integrated into mainstream Earth system science. Feedbacks between life and planet are not only real, they are essential. We see them everywhere. In today's oceans, where phytoplankton release dimethyl sulfide seeding clouds. In rainforests, where trees cycle water and maintain their own local climates. In coral reefs, where carbonate chemistry buffers against acidification. These are not ancient relics, they are modern echoes. and they remind us that the great oxidation event wasn't a thing that happened and ended. It was the start of something ongoing. The breath that changed the world has never really stopped. We inhale its legacy, exhale its consequences, live in the balance it created, and science, deep science, keeps reading. Reading atoms like words, reading spectra like sentences, reading silence like a story that's still being told. Recovery in deep time does not unfold like healing in a human story. There is no moment of triumph, no single dawn after a long night. The planet doesn't exhale relief or wipe away the debris. Instead, it breathes differently. It adapts. It reshapes itself in silence, over spans so vast that even the scars become landscapes. After the great oxidation event, Earth did not return to balance. It found a new one. In the wake of oxygen's rise, the ecosystems that had once dominated the world were shattered. The microbial kingdoms that thrived in methane-rich, anoxic waters were forced into exile. Some perished. Others found refuge in the shadows. Deep sediments, hot springs, isolated basins untouched by the sky's new breath. The surface, once their dominion, now belonged to something unfamiliar. Oxygen was not kind. It was reactive, ruthless, radical. It rusted iron. It burned organic compounds. It made metabolic life both more powerful and more precarious. Cells that couldn't handle it died. Those that could evolved. The oceans changed first. The once green seas, heavy with iron and haze, turned a pale blue in some places as oxygen cleared the waters. Iron began to fall out of solution, forming rusted sediments instead of nourishing plankton. Sulfide, once widespread, was pushed deeper into the sediments or into isolated basins. New chemical gradients appeared, surface layers rich in oxygen, deeper ones still anoxic. This vertical stratification created strange layered ecosystems. In the oxygenated shallows, new microbial communities took root. Photosynthesizers expanded, spreading across coastlines and continental shelves. In the darker depths, sulfur reducers, methanogens, and fermentation specialists continued their slow work, now disconnected from the surface world they once ruled. And between these layers, new interactions began to stir. Aerobic respiration emerged, not as a replacement, but as an addition. It didn't spread overnight. It took millions of years for organisms to fully adopt it, to build the enzymatic machinery that could use oxygen efficiently without being destroyed by it. But once they did, the rules of energy changed. Suddenly, life could extract more power from the same molecules. Aerobic metabolism yielded orders of magnitude more ATP than anaerobic fermentation. That extra energy didn't just feed the cell, it enabled complexity. It allowed for longer lifespans, for larger cell size, for internal structures, for specialization, and in time, for cooperation. The seeds of multicellularity were planted not in conquest or ambition, but in necessity. Some cells grouped together to survive oxidative stress. Others formed biofilms, sharing enzymes that detoxified their surroundings. Eventually, these clusters began to coordinate, to differentiate, to divide labor. And so from the ruins of a planetary upheaval, a new kind of life began to rise. Eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, with organelles, with inner architecture, may have first emerged during this time. Their origins are still debated, but many theories suggest they arose from symbiosis. One microbe engulfing another, not as prey, but as partner. That internalized bacterium became the mitochondrion, an oxygen-handling powerhouse. It was a marriage of survival, and it changed everything. The rise of eukaryotes marked a turning point. These cells were larger, more dynamic, capable of complex behaviors. They could engulf other cells. They could move with intent. They could store and process information. They carried within them the raw potential for eyes, limbs, neurons. But they didn't rush toward complexity. Evolution never hurries. For For hundreds of millions of years, eukaryotes remained single-celled, floating in a microbial ocean. They were new, but they were still small, still vulnerable, still adapting to a world in flux. Because even as life began to recover, Earth's climate had not yet stabilised. The aftermath of the Great Oxidation included at least one, and perhaps several, global glaciations. Evidence suggests that vast ice sheets covered much of the planet, even reaching near equatorial latitudes. These so-called snowball Earth events would have been catastrophic for surface life, but not total. Life clung on in hydrothermal vents, in meltwater refuges, under the ice where sunlight still filtered through. And with each thaw, the world emerged slightly different. Ice melts, carbon builds, weathering resumes, and oxygen, once suppressed by cold and darkness, returns. It's a rhythm seen across deep time, advance and retreat, death and renewal. The biosphere doesn't simply bounce back, it reorganises. One of the long-term consequences of the Great Oxidation was the burial of massive amounts of organic carbon. When photosynthetic organisms died, their remains often sank and were buried before they could decompose completely. This burial acted as a sink for carbon and a source for oxygen. The more carbon buried, the more oxygen left in the system, and the more oxygen, the more energy available for life. It's a self-reinforcing loop, one that, under the right conditions, can create a planet that breathes more deeply with each passing age. Over time, oxygen levels continue to climb, though not steadily. The Proterozoic eon, spanning from about 2.5 billion to 541 million years ago, was a long, slow arc of adjustment. Oxygen rose, plateaued, dipped, and rose again. It shaped the mineralogy of the crust. It altered the chemistry of the oceans. It influenced tectonics, erosion, climate. It created a stage for evolution. By the time multicellular life truly took off, around 600 million years ago, Earth had already been transformed. The soils were oxidized. The atmosphere held enough oxygen to support respiration on a grand scale. Nutrients flowed from eroding continents into nutrient-rich seas, and with them came diversity, complexity, change. Animals began to appear, first as soft-bodied forms, alien in their symmetry, preserved only in rare deposits, then as shelled creatures, armoured and efficient. The Cambrian explosion, just over 500 million years ago, marked the point where life began to sculpt the biosphere with teeth and tools, predation, nervous systems, vision. None of it would have been possible without the groundwork laid 2 billion years earlier. The Great Oxidation event wasn't just a moment, it was a fulcrum, a hinge on which the future turned. Its legacy is not only seen in oxygenated air or oxidized rocks, it's seen in the architecture of cells, in the pathways of metabolism, in the very existence of organisms that breathe, move, think. Even today, the biosphere carries that memory. Every plant that photosynthesizes, every animal that respires, every molecule of hemoglobin carrying oxygen through blood, they are echoes, and the Earth remembers too. The red layers in ancient cliffs, the iron formations mined for steel, the isotope signatures in ocean cores, the metabolic genes shared across domains of life, the mitochondria humming quietly in every cell of your body. We are not just descendants of survivors. We are built from survival, from crisis, recovery and reinvention. And perhaps the most extraordinary consequence of the Great Oxidation is this: it introduced fragility. Before oxygen, life was chemically simpler, stable in its constraints. After oxygen, the world became more energetic but also more volatile. Ecosystems became dependent on a narrow range of oxygen levels. Too little, and suffocation. Too much, and combustion. This narrow band of habitability is where we still live. A 21% oxygen atmosphere, a balance maintained by forests, oceans, weathering and time. It is not guaranteed, it is not inevitable. It is managed by feedbacks, by chemistry, by life, and now by us. Modern climate change, mass extinctions, ocean deoxygenation. They're not anomalies in Earth's history. They are familiar beats in a very old rhythm. But this time, the trigger is conscious. The agent of change is aware. We know what oxygen means. We know how carbon moves. We understand the loops, the thresholds, the risks, and we're choosing. To warm, to extract, to burn, or to learn from the past. Because recovery isn't just what happens after the end. It's a process of becoming something new. Earth taught us that in its long, slow breath after catastrophe, and we are still part of that breath, still recovering, still unfolding, still changing. Take a breath. It's so easy, so automatic. The chest rises, oxygen enters, blood carries it, cells receive it. You keep going. But that breath, so casual, so unnoticed, is ancient. It is the end result of a billion-year story, a thread that began in sunlit shallows, passed through microbial lungs, froze oceans, rusted iron, and shaped the very possibility of life as we know it. It's a legacy, not just of biology, but of planetary transformation, and now we live in that legacy, surrounded by invisible structures forged long before us: air, climate, metabolism, memory. When we say the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, the words fall out easily, but we rarely let the weight of it settle in, rarely sit with what it means to be alive in a moment shaped by countless extinctions, countless recoveries, countless chances that could have gone another way. The world didn't have to look like this. It didn't have to have continents, or blue skies, or forests, or us. It didn't have to breathe, but it does, and we do, and now we are changing it. We live in an age that geologists have started calling the Anthropocene, a proposed new epoch in which human activity has become a geological force. We reshape landscapes, we burn carbon laid down in the Carboniferous, we acidify oceans, we alter the composition of the atmosphere. In just 2 centuries, barely a blink, we've nudged the planet toward a new trajectory. CO2 levels not seen in 3 million years, global temperatures rising, oxygen declining in some regions of the ocean. We are in many ways reenacting ancient processes, but at unnatural speeds, mimicking planetary feedbacks that once took millions of years, now compressed into a human lifetime. The last time methane collapsed, the planet froze. The last time carbon surged, biodiversity plummeted. The last time oxygen dipped, the seas turned to poison. And yet here we are, aware, informed, and still choosing paths with ancient consequences. But awareness is its own kind of turning point. Unlike cyanobacteria, we can read the signs. Unlike volcanoes, we can pause. Unlike asteroids, we can redirect. The question isn't whether we affect the planet. The question is, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Because every time we light a match, we draw from a world shaped by breath. Every time we plant a tree, we join the cycle. Every conversation about climate, energy, extinction, it's not about politics. It's about memory and responsibility. The Earth doesn't need saving. It will persist. It has survived worse. But what survives on Earth, that's the part we shape. And that means we are caretakers of a rare experiment. Life here, now. Of the millions of planets we've glimpsed, Earth remains the only one we know that holds life. Oceans, weather, atmosphere, and organisms in constant conversation. A planet that was once a rock, and now listens to itself. To harm that is not simply unwise, it is to forget what breath cost. But this reflection isn't meant to be a warning. It's meant to be a reminder that we are part of this, that we've always been part of this. When you inhale, you're accepting a gift given 2 billion years ago. When you exhale, you contribute to a balance held delicately across forests, fungi, oceans, and wind. When you walk across the ground, the iron beneath your feet remembers a time before oxygen. When you touch rust, You're touching the aftermath of microbial revolution. And when you look up at the stars, wondering if we are alone, you're asking a question that began the moment Earth breathed. Modern science gives us tools to read this past. Climate models, satellite imagery, atmospheric chemistry. These are not just instruments, they are mirrors. They show us what is, what was, and what might be. We've detected oxygen in exoplanet models. We've seen methane on Mars. We've sent rovers, orbiters, telescopes, all with the quiet hope of seeing ourselves in the dust of another world. Because if it happened here, it could happen elsewhere. But if it's rare, if Earth truly is 1 in a billion, then that rarity is sacred. It means we are stewards not just of a planet, but of a possibility. This is the parallel, that what began as a microbial change in ocean chemistry now lives in us, in our science, in our ethics, in our stories. The Great Oxidation event was not a thing that happened to someone else. It happened to us. We are its inheritors, its consequence, and we can be its continuation. The Earth will go on, with or without us. But the part that listens, that cares, that reflects, that's ours to carry. So take another breath. Feel it enter unnoticed. Let it remind you, not just of life, but of time. The kind of time that changes oceans. The kind that leaves no fossil but alters everything. The kind that flows through you now. So, what time is it where you are? Is it morning with sunlight sliding softly across your room? Is it night, quiet and full of stars, the world slowing just enough to breathe? Or maybe it's somewhere in between, just like Earth was once, between silence and song, between chaos and calm, between extinction and becoming. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Just About Earth, where the past is never really past, and even the air around us has stories to tell. If you found this soothing, curious, or quietly extraordinary, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment below. It helps more than you'd think, and it means this journey can continue together. What would you like to explore next? Maybe the time Earth turned into a snowball, or how ancient fungi helped forests walk onto land, or what secrets lie beneath the ocean floor, locked away in heat and stone. Let me know. Until then, rest easy, stay curious, and remember, even your breath is made of stars and ancient oceans. Even your quietest thoughts are part of Earth's longest story. We'll be here whenever you're ready to listen again. Good night.